this is not a manifesto, because a word association test with manifesto gave us the word lie. And is that any surprising given just how many broken promises we've seen in British politics over the last few general elections? No, manifestos are a means of telling people what they want to hear without ever having the genuine desire to implement them. So it is a contract with the people, and these are the policies that not only will we campaign on over the course of the next 3 weeks, but we'll campaign on these in the years to come. Already, just 8 months into our existence, we've already changed the landscape of political politics, and we will change it very much more greatly in the years to come. We're told that this is the Brexit election, and yet there's been almost no discussion on the withdrawal agreement or the terms of Brexit whatsoever. Though I have to say, the debate the other night did expose the fact that Jeremy Corbyn's party absolutely refused to answer which side they would campaign on in their second referendum. And for us, it's perfectly clear that there are 5 million Labour Leave voters who have been absolutely betrayed by the Labour Party. And after 3.5 years of failure from a Conservative government, I have to say that when I saw Boris Johnson's so-called deal, I was less than impressed. It simply was not Brexit. And I was struck again by the number of people who spoke, saying they supported it without ever actually having read it. Now, a couple of weeks ago, Boris did indicate a change of direction. He said, we will leave in 2020, but more significantly, that he's going to negotiate a super Canada plus deal without alignment. And that is progress, because if we leave the European Union and we find ourselves aligned in everything from financial services to fisheries, we have not actually left. So we took that promise and we said, OK, on the basis of that, we will concentrate our firepower against Labour and against the Remainers. And that is exactly what we are doing. Be in no doubt, we want a clean break from the political institutions of the EU. And you can get that with a Canada-style trade deal, just as you can get it leaving on WTO terms. I have to say that we will be looking at the Conservative manifesto when it's launched on Sunday and reading the words in it very carefully indeed. We need the Brexit Party to hold Boris Johnson to his word. We need the Brexit Party voice there in the House of Commons, or we're not going to get anything like what we voted for 3.5 years ago. And there are 130 seats up and down the country that the Conservatives have never won and never will win. There are a lot of Labour voters who just cannot and will not ever bring themselves to vote Conservative, but they will vote for us. They showed that in the European elections, and they're showing it now, and we are now beginning to dig into that old Labour vote, which puts us in our key target seats in a position where we can get over the line in some of them. And as for splitting the vote, the argument that was doing the rounds a few weeks ago, just as it did, incidentally, when I led UKIP back in 2015, arguably in many of the Tories' key target seats, we're actually making it rather easier for them because we're picking up Labour votes that would never ever go to the Conservatives. But Brexit for us is just the beginning, not the end, of a much needed political revolution. Never before in this country has public confidence in politics, politicians, our electoral systems ever been lower than it is today. And the Brexit Party are the party of the new radicals. That is who we are. We want to bring politics and our democracy into the 21st century. We genuinely do want to change politics for good. And that begins with a voting system that is hopelessly out of date, suitable perhaps when there are just two parties fighting elections, but it doesn't work anymore, leads to millions of people feeling, what is the point of voting at all? And it also leads, I think, to very negative politics. It leads to, you think we're bad? Look at the other guy. He's even worse. I do think a degree of proportionality in the system would see parties campaigning on a much more positive agenda. And I'm astonished that nobody seems to want to reform the postal voting system, something that has been totally abused since it was opened up nearly 20 years ago. We've seen fraud, intimidation, several court cases, people going to prison, and yet it seems to suit the two parties to keep the postal voting system as it is. We would scrap the register in its entirety and go back to basics. If you work abroad or you're infirm, you can register for a postal vote. And of course, the reason that the big head-to-head debates, all the big policy launches are taking place this week is because postal votes go out over the course of this weekend, and by next Wednesday, 25% or more of this election will actually be over. That's why this is such a crucial time. We want to reform that. And we are sickened in many ways by the system of political patronage that we see in this country. Frankly, I do think the way appointments to the House of Lords and indeed other honours are used borders on corruption, and the House of Lords now is no longer fit for purpose, and we think it needs to go. What 2016 showed us is that if you give people the chance to speak, they will. We saw a massive turnout and a result that surprised pretty much everybody. And it says to me that citizens should be able to call referendums on key issues if there is a fundamental disconnect between what is happening in Westminster and what is happening out in the country. And we would propose a citizens' initiative, an ability where if 5 million people sign a valid register, they're able to get a referendum on an issue of their choice. But that's political reform. We also have some problems deep, I think, within our institutions, and in particular, a highly politicised civil service, something that was unthinkable 20 years ago, as we prided ourselves as being the one country in the world that genuinely had a neutral, independent civil service. Certainly in the last 3.5 years, that, I'm afraid, has been exposed. And we do believe that people working for the civil service should sign a pledge of political neutrality. That would be a very good place to start. There's also some real thinking got to go on about the Supreme Court. I mean, it is a political court, and it's acting without any guidelines whatsoever. So I think we're going to have, and this won't be easy, it'll take years, but I think we are going to have a constitutional convention working out just what sort of written code, just what sort of written constitution there needs to be in this country, so that firstly, no referendum in the future can be said to be not legally binding. They all told us it was, of course. They would implement the result. But later they tell us that actually that wasn't constitutional. And secondly, as I say, the Supreme Court needs to have some political guidelines to work from. And the BBC is another huge institution in this country, which frankly, in a modern age of consumer choice and streaming, has become an anachronism. I do understand that it's an important global brand for this country, but I would propose that we phase out the licence fee over a period of time. In all of those things that I've just said, as leader of the New Radicals, none of those things will happen with the Conservative and Labour parties. They don't want any fundamental change or reform to the system at all, and I detect there's a big change of mood out there in the country. This is something that will become part of the mainstream debate. Whether it's over the next 3 weeks or whether it's in time, I don't know the answer, but the need and desire for political and institutional reform is enormous. Now, on the night of the referendum, I was about 30 yards away from here in the bar at Reels at 3:10 in the morning when it became clear that the Leave vote was going to win. And that next morning, I was on College Green and I said that this had been the victory for the little people. Well, as yet, 3.5 years on, there's been nothing for the little people, nothing for the ordinary people whatsoever, as our politics and our debate around the economy continues to be dominated by giant corporate global business. So we're going to put forward some ideas that we're going to campaign on that would help ordinary people, the little people in our country. We want to cut the cost of living, and a very good place to start, and again, you can't do this unless you have a clean break Brexit from the European institutions. But a very good place to start this would be to remove VAT on domestic fuel bills. That would save the average family in this country £65 a year. And we would like to reduce the family food bill, the family clothing bill, the family footwear bill. I mean, over 20% of foodstuffs that we buy in our shops come in from outside the European Union and, of course, have tariff put on them. So we can use Brexit as a means to help the consumer, use Brexit to help the average family. But, of course, I must emphasise again, you can only do these things if you're outside the European Union's customs union. And we do want to invest very much in our left-behind coastal communities. Many of the areas of highest deprivation in Britain are in our coastal towns and communities, and that of course means we've got to get back that 200-mile or the median line exclusive economic zone. That can lead to great regeneration in some of the most deprived areas of our country. I came into this from business. I worked for big firms, but equally I set up my own small firm. I ran it for 9 years. There's virtually nobody sitting on the front benches of either party who has ever set up their own business or realised just how difficult that has become in the modern world. And we are the party for small business and for small people. We need, post leaving the European Union, to try to lift the regulatory burden that is there on small businesses. If the FSB are right, and if the average small employer is now spending between 20 and 25% of their week on compliance, that's an awful lot of time that is lost to productivity, wealth creation and job creation. And we propose quite an important but radical change to corporation tax. 1 million companies, that's 2/3 of all registered companies in this country, do not make more than £10,000 a year. A lot of them are new start-up companies. And we propose introducing a £10,000 threshold at which corporation tax begins to be paid. It'll take a big weight off the mind of many struggling small companies. It won't be so good for the accountants, and I understand that, but when you think of the cost of going to an accountant, registering, paying a very small amount of income tax, you probably get a bill from the accountant bigger than the amount of tax you send to the Exchequer. And similarly, what does it cost HMRC to collect tiny amounts of money from hundreds of thousands of companies? And that, I think, would be a real victory for the little people. As Jake mentioned, in the European election campaign, we started to talk about the need for regional investment, that not everything in this country should just be about London. And I'm pleased that in many ways we've kicked off that debate, because that is now being talked about by the Conservative Party. It is being talked about by the Labour Party. And yes, of course, we're talking about digital infrastructure. We're talking, of course, about the need, very much huge need, for transport links. We're even talking in many parts of the UK about a lack of mobile phone connectivity. So yes, there's an argument to make big investments in the regions. But unlike all the others in this campaign of promises, where 100 billion here, 200 billion there are being thrown around by the Labour and Conservative parties. Indeed, I think so far an election campaign in which nobody believes anything they're being told in terms of promises. And when people are surveyed, they can't even remember what those promises were. Well, we're going to put on the table an idea of how we could pay for much of this. Pay for schemes that will benefit many millions, not just a few. And HS2 strikes us as being a project which actually will benefit just a few thousand people, costing at least 100 billion sterling, and we would want to save that money. We, of course, would want to stop sending 13 billion every single year to the European Union. We'd want to claim back the £7 billion that, incredibly, Philip Hammond just left on the table at the European Investment Bank, and the foreign aid budget, so much of which is spent to simply meet political targets, so much of which is spent in ways that we would not approve of. We propose cutting the foreign aid budget. All in all, you see there savings of 200 billion sterling. As I say, the others will tell you how they're going to spend money, not how they're going to fund ideas. We're telling you how we will actually fund ideas. On that morning of the 24th of June, one of the issues that disappeared off the radar of British politics was immigration. It had been the dominant issue every year for the previous 5 years, the thing that people were talking about. And I think with the Brexit vote, people thought, well, that's it. It's done. It's sorted. It's all over. Well, take us to this election where certainly the Labour Party conference appear to want to open up the doors pretty unconditionally, and where the Labour manifesto makes it very clear that foreign nationals coming into the country will, of course, get the vote. It would appear pretty much immediately. Now, from the Conservatives, well, I've been saying for years we need an Australian-style point system, and at least they're now saying that. But of course, they make absolutely no commitment whatsoever to reducing numbers. And the truth of it is, they've got no intention to reduce numbers. Many of their big business backers want as much cheap labour as they can possibly get into this country. We have a population crisis directly as a result of policies since the late 1990s, and you see that not just on the impact on public services, but actually there's an argument here about the quality of life. There's an argument here that as we inexorably head towards 70 million people being here by the end of the next decade, that actually that does damage to people's lives, to people's communities. You cannot measure how content a country is by simply looking at GDP numbers. There is such a thing as society and community, and I think that has too much been ignored. So we would very much want to get immigration numbers down to what for 60 years were very acceptable and very workable post-war levels. And yes, I'm talking around about 50,000 people every year. But of course, we're going to need flexibility on work permits. But please recognise the difference between the automatic right to settle and the right to come and work for a time-limited period. And it also leads in, you know, I've met so many people running businesses, running engineering companies, indeed people at hospitals, saying we just in this country do not train enough of our own people. And again, this is long term. It's going to take more than a couple of years to turn this around, but we do need to invest in our own people. On illegal immigration, well, I think we probably need to do something to stop the human tragedy we saw in the back of that lorry the other week with 39 dead people. But even today, there are boats coming across the English Channel, and we all know that the Border Force bring them in to Dover. They're kept by the police for 24 hours, and then virtually everybody disappears. No one seems to think it matters. In fact, the Prime Minister is on record several times in the past supporting amnesties for illegal immigrants. We think that is heading in the wrong direction. We think a strong message that says, if you come here illegally across the channel or in the back of a container, that you won't be allowed to stay, will prevent further human tragedy. And it's the right thing to do. On big areas of debate like the National Health Service, well, just don't believe the lies that Labour say, whether it's about us wanting to privatise the health service or Donald Trump wanting to buy it. None of it actually is true. And we are, of course, committed to it. And it will need more money. With a rapidly expanding population, it will need more money. Though I am struck, if you actually listen to what all the party leaders say on the National Health Service, they're all aiming for the same outcome. If ever there was an issue that should be depoliticised and where parties could perhaps work together, I'm struck that it could be in an area like health. Now, there's many other things I'm talking about in here. We're talking about the environment particularly, which has risen up the agenda. And I have to say, the sheer hypocrisy of governments and a parliament that talks about recycling but is only too happy for hundreds of thousands of tonnes of our waste to go to landfill sites in China, or to be dumped at sea strikes us as being a nonsense that needs to be stopped. And everybody talks about reducing CO2 output. And that's not an easy thing to do without deindustrialising the country. Clearly, we're trying to make progress, but we've got to recognise that when it comes to CO2 production, we are less than 2% of global output. But there's been too little talk about CO2 absorption. And I've been campaigning for a few months now on the idea that trees provide a significant part of the answer. But I don't think that planting tens of millions of trees just here in the United Kingdom, well, it might be good for biodiversity, yes, but it's not going to make a big difference. Here's an example of a policy where we should become a global leader. Here's an idea of a policy where we should go to the United Nations, speak to some of the big governments that we know in America and elsewhere, and let's lead a global initiative. Let's aim to plant hundreds of billions of trees over the course of the next decade. Something practical, something sensible that we can do. There's much else in this document. We cover pretty much every area of British domestic life and indeed our role in the international community. We have already changed the face of British politics. Without us, there will be no genuine Brexit. We now want to lead the next phase, which is a political revolution that puts the ordinary people first. Thank you.